On Friday, you read or started to read about Canada's history and culture. Today we're going to take a closer look at this text. We're going to read it carefully, look at the main ideas, look at the key terms, analyze the text, and answer the questions. Let's start by looking at the main ideas. As we read through this text, we should be able to understand that beginning in the 1600s, Europeans settled the region that would later become Canada. In this text, we should also be able to read and understand that immigration and migration to cities have shaped Canadian culture. Let's look at the key terms and places. As we read today, these words will be in bold. If you come across one of these words, go back and look at the key terms and places. Quebec. The Quebec province of Canada was first settled by the French. Provinces. Provinces are administrative divisions of a country. British Columbia. British Columbia is a province of Canada located on the Pacific coast. And Toronto. Toronto is Canada's largest city. Let's begin reading the history of Canada. As we read through these 3 paragraphs, we need to circle the names of Canada's first people and circle the names of Canada's first permanent European settlers. After reading these 3 paragraphs, we should also be able to answer question number 2. How did the French and Indian War affect the French colonists in New France? Also, be looking out for the word dominion. When we get to the end of these 3 paragraphs, we should be able to say what a dominion is. History. Indians and Inuit were the first people to live in Canada. The Cree Indians lived on the plains. They survived by hunting bison. The Inuit lived in the far north. They learned to survive in the harsh, cold climate by hunting seals, whales, and other animals. Question number 1 asked us to circle the names of Canada's first people and Canada's first permanent European settlers. In the first paragraph that we just read, I saw the words first people to live in Canada. So that's a clue that I can answer part of question number 1. Do you see the names of the first people to live in Canada? The Indians and the Inuit were the first people to live in Canada. Specifically, the Cree Indians. As we finish reading, let's see if we can find the names of Canada's first permanent European settlers. The Vikings were the first Europeans to come to Canada, but they did not stay. European explorers and fishermen came in the late 1400s. Europeans soon began to trade with native Canadians. The French built the first permanent settlements in what became Canada. They called the lands they claimed New France. In the 1700s, Britain defeated France in the French and Indian War. Although the British took control, most French settlers stayed. Their way of life did not change much. Many descendants of these French settlers live in Quebec today. As we read, did you see the names of Canada's first permanent European settlers? In the second paragraph, they say the Vikings were the first Europeans to come to Canada. but they did not stay. So the Vikings are not permanent European settlers. As we continue to read, it says Europeans soon began to trade with native Canadians. The French built the first permanent settlement in what became Canada. So there we see the word permanent. The French were the first permanent settlers to Canada. While we're here, let's see if we can answer question number 2. How did the French and Indian War affect the French colonists in New France? In the 1700s, Britain defeated France in the French and Indian War. Although the British took control, most French settlers stayed. Their way of life did not change much. So if we look at question number 2 again, how did the French and Indian War affect the French colonists in New France? The answer is it really didn't affect them that much because their way of life did not change much. So to answer this question, I would say the French lost the French and Indian War, but their way of life didn't change much. As we read the next paragraph, remember, we're looking for the word dominion. What is a dominion? The British divided their territory into 2 colonies called the Upper and Lower Canada. The colony stayed divided until 1867, when the British passed a law making Canada a dominion, a territory under British influence. This act gave Canada its own government. The British also divided the country into provinces. So what is a dominion? A dominion is a territory under British influence. Remember, when we are restating questions that ask us about a definition, we start with a dominion is. Make sure you use a complete sentence to answer this question. Let's continue reading section 2. In 1885, Canadians completed a railroad across Canada. It connected British Columbia with the eastern provinces. Canada increased in size by buying lands in the north where many Canadians live. Now let's read about Canada's culture. As we read, we should circle the countries where some of Canada's immigrants came from. Canadians come from many places. Some are descendants of the early French and British settlers. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, many immigrants came from Europe and the United States. Some hoped to find gold in Canada's Yukon Territory. Many Asian immigrants have come to Canada, especially from China, Japan, and India. Many Chinese immigrants came to work on the railroads. Immigrants helped Canada's economy grow. British Columbia was the first Canadian province to have a large Asian minority. After World War II, a new wave of immigrants came to large cities like Toronto. Many came from Asia, others came from Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. In recent years, Canadians have also moved from farms and rural areas to large cities like Vancouver and Ontario. So So again, our question says to circle the countries where some of Canada's immigrants came from. So as we read, we saw the word French, which tells us that some of their early settlers came from France. We also have the word British, which tells us that people emigrated to Canada from Britain. We also have the United States, China, Japan, and India. Although the question asked us to circle countries, there are many continents listed here. Europe is a continent. Asia is a continent. We also have Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. The Caribbean and Latin America are not continents, but they're areas that have more than one country included in them. So as we read about Canada's culture, we were able to see that people emigrated to Canada from the countries France, Britain, the United States, China, Japan, and India. We can also see that people emigrated from the continents Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Caribbean, Latin America, and the United States are all part of North America. So people also emigrated to Canada from other areas of North America. Now that we've finished reading, let's go back and look at the main ideas. Main idea number 1. Beginning in the 1600s, Europeans settled the region that would later become Canada. When we read about Canada's history, we could see that the Vikings first came to Canada, but they did not settle there. Later, Europeans came to Canada from France and Britain, and they ended up settling in Canada. Main idea number 2. Immigration and migration to cities have shaped Canadian culture. Just like the United States, people have moved to Canada from all over the world, and they have created a very diverse culture in Canada, a melting pot like the United States. So immigration, people move to Canada from different countries. But also within Canada, people have migrated. We read today that people moved to the larger cities of Canada from more rural areas, and that has also helped to shape Canadian culture. I hope you enjoyed learning about Canada's history and culture today with the sounds of my crazy cats, BB and Mila, in the background.